Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 4 of the second round playoff series between the San Jose Barracuda and the Colorado Eagles, in which the Barracuda have lost 3-1. And with this loss, the San Jose Barracuda season has officially come to an end, a best-of-5 3-1 series loss to the Titans of the Pacific Division, the Colorado Eagles. And this is unfortunate for obvious reasons, but one big one is the fact that we never actually got to see this San Jose Barracuda team at full strength in these playoffs. Obviously, there was the major injury to Shakir Mukhamadullin that he sustained back with the Sharks. He was never going to play any playoff games for the Barracuda this year after that, but it was more so those short-term injuries that were actually very close to returning. Andrew Podorowski, the team and league MVP this season, Thomas Bordeleau, an important piece of the Barracuda's offense, as well as the most recently injured Colin White from just yesterday. All of these very, very close. In fact, with Game 5 being a few days from now on Sunday, it is certainly possible at least one of those players could have returned to play. And then had the Barracuda made it to round 3, I imagine all of them would have been healthy enough to be in the lineup for Game 1 of that future series, but they end up falling short just right here. And this is a very important lesson for the Barracuda. If you go back to the regular season, they were a team that were extremely up and down. Obviously, they had to deal with, the Sharks poaching some of their players throughout the season as they traded guys away and had injuries, so it was not an easy situation for the Barracuda to deal with. But even just on a game-to-game basis with the same lineup, you could see the Barracuda come out, completely dominate, big 6-1 victory, and then 24 hours later come out and just get shut out 5-0 where they were never even remotely competitive. This type of up and down performance led to, of course, a playoff spot, but one in which they only qualified as the 6th seed. This was fine in the first round where they were able to take down the Ontario Reign, but going into the second round with that reseeding, they ended up against that top team, Colorado here. Had they made it as the 3rd or 4th seed, maybe they have a matchup with the Coachella Valley Firebirds instead in the second round, a team they've had a lot of success against this season. That could have got them to the 3rd round. That could have gotten them to being a healthier team, and then a matchup with Colorado may have been a bit more in their favor. But because the regular season doesn't go as planned, they end up in this spot and the injuries burn them. What also makes this game rather unfortunate from just a particular one tonight is that I actually thought this was perhaps the best game of this series for the San Jose Barracuda, even including the game they won back in Game 2 in San Jose. They actually played rather well in the first and second periods here tonight. They were the better team, and this is quite interesting to see because as we saw yesterday, Colorado really, really good when they're playing on home ice. They were exceptionally dominant in the first period of last game where the Barracuda were simply just trying to survive. So the fact that they were able to come into their barn here tonight and actually put up a really great performance and take control of this game in those first 40 minutes, I thought was very impressive. But the major issue that has continued to plague the Barracuda throughout this series, and even honestly going back to the first round against Ontario, is the fact that they have struggled to put the puck in the net. They're just not getting the goal scoring required. And so despite the strength they showed in those first two periods, the score was still 0-0 after 40 minutes. Now the Barracuda would strike first in the third period, coming from Chernyshov, his first goal in the AHL in his first playoff game in the AHL. That made it 1-0, and this was important. As we know, the Eagles can shut things down defensively through the neutral zone when they have a lead, but when they're trailing, that can open things up a little bit more. But this lead did not last long. Just a couple minutes later, the Eagles tie it up, and then a couple minutes after that, the Barracuda take a very ill-advised penalty, and they are able to capitalize on the power play that get the eventual game winner. And this was another difference maker here tonight. The Eagles score on their special teams. The Barracuda failed to do so. They had multiple power plays. They even had a full 4-minute power play on a double minor, and yet that one started off just absolutely horribly. The Barracuda looked so out of sync with the man advantage, and that was again another difference maker here tonight. But even with those final few minutes still remaining on the clock after the Felleber goal made it 2-1, you're thinking that the Barracuda would show some urgency, would show some fight, and give it all they got to try and tie this one up and force a third straight overtime here. But we really didn't get that. It felt as though there was a lack of urgency here tonight from the Barracuda, and they made things a little too easy on Colorado. I mentioned last review that the hardest game of the season for any particular team is one in which they're trying to eliminate their opponents. This should have been an extremely difficult last few minutes for the Eagles to navigate, where they're having to sacrifice the body and make any possible play to stay alive. And yet the Barracuda, it was just too much of a cakewalk for them. And San Jose, it felt as though they just didn't have anything left in the tank in those last few minutes. And so eventually it ends up with just an empty netter and the Barracuda losing this 3-1. Moving on to the players to talk about, we had some lineup changes here tonight, as well as some movement on top of that with no Colin White. Players have to get bumped up, and so it is Philip Bystedt who finds himself on this top line. Not that much of a surprise, because we were seeing him get that type of deployment last game. So he plays with Regenda and Graf. This was a game for Bystedt where I don't think it was actually as good as he was yesterday. Definitely not. It was maybe slightly better than what we saw in games 1 and games 2, but that's not really saying much. I think the big thing here from Philip Bystedt that we saw throughout these entire playoffs is that it was the type of performance that really mirrored what we saw from him in the regular season. Up and down, very inconsistent, some really good games, some not so very good games, and so that's kind of what has been his first season here in the AHL in North America. If you asked me whether or not I believe Bystedt will be able to make the Sharks next season, I would say almost certainly not, but I don't think that's the end of the world. What I do want to see him do next season is take a massive step forward. This does need to be a player who can actually find success in the top 6 in the AHL, because he was forced into this role during these playoffs because of the injury to Podorowski and Bordelot and White. Their center depth was heavily challenged, and so Bystedt maybe having to play a little bit above his pay grade, but next year, this is the type of role that he needs to find success in. It didn't happen in these playoffs. Hopefully it does next year. When it comes to his two line mates, or at least the one line mate to talk about here, that is Colin Graf. I thought Graf had a good start to this game. I was hoping he would be able to really take this one over and provide some offense for the San Jose Sharks. He came quite close. He had some great shots on that terrible 4-minute power play that the Barracuda did have before they end up taking a penalty and ruining it. Graf did have one extremely good chance where he just moved around multiple different Eagles players and then got absolutely robbed by the Eagles goaltender. That was nice to see, but then as we got to the latter half, and in particular the third period, Graf kind of faded a little bit and didn't have the strongest end to this game. So generally, as a whole for these playoffs, Graf, I thought, looked pretty good. I don't think he necessarily torpedoed his chances of being a player for the Sharks roster next season, but I don't necessarily think he really stamped his name there. He will need to have at least a solid preseason to get onto that starting NHL roster. When it comes to the Barracuda's second line, we have Giles and Cardwell playing with Igor Chernyshov, his first game of these playoffs. And this is as good a time as any to mention some of the other lineup substitutions that the Barracuda made here tonight, because a couple players do end up stepping out. Obviously, Colin White due to the injury. Walker Duehr also ends up, I believe, as a healthy scratch here. This perhaps a punishment due to the huge mistake he made on that overtime game winner. McCarthy clearly not a big fan, so he sits this one out. Chernyshov steps in, and you would think the other player stepping in here as well would be Quentin Musty. He would end up playing in this game, but it is not the case. Van Roboys instead joins that fourth line, and it is Houle playing with Van Roboys and Vincent, and then Sabarin gets bumped up to the third to play with Ostapchuk and Gushin. And this is just really kind of just a incomprehensible decision, I would say, for McCarthy. I tried to justify it yesterday when I said, oh, maybe it's the altitude, maybe it's the conditioning, maybe it's the fact that the Barracuda are playing back-to-back games, but for him to not play yesterday, game 3, and also not play here tonight in game 4, it just doesn't make any sense. As I said, at the end of the day, the AHL is still a development league. Quentin Musty is still one of the Sharks' top prospects, and he was very far from being a liability in that game too. He played rather well. It was the only game that the Barracuda actually won in this series. I don't see any possible reasoning besides some sort of injury, which we pretty much know was not the case, for Musty to not play here tonight. The fact that, overlooking this playoffs as a whole, Musty has played 1 of 6 games, and then the same goes for Chernyshov, despite both of them having really good outings in each of those games that they played. it's just not a great look for a team that was struggling to score so considerably. I don't understand why Musty could not have taken Hool's place in this lineup, put him on the third line with Gushyn and Ostapchuk, move Sabrin down to the fourth line with Van Roboys and Vincent, which is a fourth line that the Barracuda have ran and had success with pretty much all season long. I just don't get the perspective here from John McCarthy. This was a young player who showcased some great things in that second game, and you don't even give him another chance. And then when it comes to Chernyshov, what we're kind of learning here in this fourth game is, why was this not a player who was in the lineup earlier than tonight? Because he was one of the better players for the Barracuda in this game. It felt as though many of the times he would step on the ice, some level of offense would be generated, some chance would occur, and for a team that was, again, struggling to score as much as the Barracuda were doing so throughout these entire playoffs as a whole, the fact that Chernyshov was as much of a positive impact as he really ended up being is just kind of making you feel as though there was a missed opportunity here from the Barracuda coaching staff. He scores the only goal of this game for the Barracuda, not exactly like a highly skilled one, it's just a lucky bounce off of his skate, but they played in the offensive zone a lot. These types of bounces will eventually occur, and this was not the only opportunity that Chernyshov got for himself or set up for his teammates. Like I said, he played very, very well. What this means moving forward for Chernyshov, honestly, the sky's the limit, I would say. Yeah, you could obviously pencil him into being a big-time player for this Barracuda team next season, but this was a very promising outing, and I would not count him out completely for perhaps making the jump to the NHL. What's important to remember here is that while this was his first AHL playoff game ever, and he also had played his first AHL regular season game prior to the end of the year, he did have time during his draft year in the KHL. He played a handful of games there, so he's not completely unfamiliar with what this type of man's game looks like. And so he would be jumping into an NHL role, which is obviously still exceptionally difficult, much better than the AHL, much better than the KHL, but not a fully unfamiliar, strange sensation for him. He could be a dark horse to make it to that Sharks roster. When it comes to the two other players on this line, Patrick Giles, yes, he did take that really bad penalty that led to the Felleberg game winner. Not a great look for him, but generally, I thought Patrick Giles was perhaps the Barracuda's best forward throughout these entire playoffs. I thought he looked very impressive, and this just continues a trend for Giles where he has just looked very impressive since the Sharks originally acquired him near the deadline from the Florida Panthers. He looked quite good in a fourth line role, decent enough in a third line role, and then when he got sent down to the Barracuda, he looked quite good for them at the end of the regular season and played very well throughout these playoffs, and in particular here tonight when you remove that one penalty that he took. So I really have liked Giles. An interesting decision that the Sharks have with this particular player going into next year. And then when it comes to Ethan Cardwell, I will say I do think this was his best game of the series. He was not very good in Game 1. He was slightly better, kind of okay there yesterday in Game 3. Here tonight, though, he was creating more offense. This could be perhaps the Igor Chernyshov effect, where playing with a very good offensive player allows you to shine a little bit more in that area. That definitely could be the reason, but it was also sort of similar to Colin Graff, where Cardwell had a great start, didn't have so much a great finish, but all in all, don't think it was his worst game, for sure not, definitely his best. And when it comes to the third line, we have Gushyn with Ostapchuk and Sabrin. We'll start off with Danil Gushyn. This was a playoffs where there was a true opportunity here for Gushyn. No Podorowski nor Bordeleau, so he ends up being one of the most skilled players on this roster. Him and Colin Graff really kind of leading the way in that area. Gushyn obviously hasn't had the type of season that he would have liked. He obviously would have liked to play more games in the NHL, and besides those first 10 and then the last couple, that didn't quite end up happening. But these playoffs could have been the chance to try and earn himself a spot still with the Sharks going into next season, and it seems as though maybe that's not quite what he was aiming for. There were rumors that he would make the jump to the KHL last offseason. It didn't happen. Those rumors will definitely return this offseason, and maybe that's just simply his plan at this point. I don't think Gushyn played bad throughout this series. I don't even think Gushyn necessarily played bad today or tonight, but it was kind of a feeling of maybe wanting more from this player, feeling that there could have been an extra gear reached that we didn't quite see, in particular here tonight. He managed to get some shots on net. He certainly wasn't a terrible player, but just felt as though there was more of a room to step forward and be a a clear offensive piece for this team, and he just didn't quite manage to do so. So when it comes to signing a new contract, for instance, at this offseason, even if Gushchin is threatening to walk, I really don't think Mike Grier is going to be, begging him to stay. He might be packing his bags for him. When it comes to then Zach Ostapchuk, really the only word that you could possibly use to describe this player is underwhelming. That is what has been the case for his time with the Sharks. That has been his case for the time with the Barracuda here. And that's just quite disappointing to see, because as I talked about with Giles, it's one thing to not maybe move the needle all that much in the NHL. Giles I thought was a pretty good fourth liner, but it's not as though he's scoring goals left and right or anything like that. But then when you see Giles get dropped down to this lower level here in the AHL, that's where he actually shows off his offensive talent. That should have been the case for Ostapchuk. You go down from the really tough NHL, you come to a league where there's more room, less skilled players, you can shine more, and we didn't actually see that from any of these games that Ostapchuk played. If there was at least like one or two where Ostapchuk looked really good and then a few others that didn't look all that great, I'd say, you know what, he's adjusting to a new team, it's not that bad. But all of the 6 games that he played, he was just underwhelming to be sure. Now, the one saving grace I'll say is that if we actually go back to the player that the Sharks originally traded for Ostapchuk, Fabian Zetterlund, when he was acquired a couple of years ago in the Timo Meier deal, he played about 20 games to end out that season for the Sharks, and he was terrible. Like, it was not remotely good. It didn't look as though there were any saving graces in his game. The Sharks brought him back for the next season, and then suddenly he looked actually a lot better and became a fan favorite for the Sharks. I'm not saying the same will happen with Ostapchuk, but I am saying that we don't want to completely count this player out. He got drafted by the Ottawa Senators. Perhaps he thought he was going to be a long-time Ottawa Senator, and then suddenly his life is flipped upside down. He's moved to an entirely different country as well, even though they're pretty close. But still, it's a tough situation to adjust to perhaps at that deadline. I'll hold out hope that maybe this entire offseason he'll really put some work in and he'll come back stronger next year. I'm not saying it's going to happen again, but let's see what happens there. And then when we move on now to the defense, of course, still just a couple of players to talk about. First would be Luca Cagnoni. It should be noted that I think this was the first game of these playoffs we actually saw some changes to the defensive pairings by McCarthy. So Cagnoni, instead of his usual partner Frisch, he ends up playing with Schultz here. Cagnoni, though, I think like Graf, like Gushchin, like Cardwell, struggle to really generate all that much offense. You do have to, at a point, give credit to the Colorado Eagles. There's a reason why this team was top in the Pacific Division, perhaps best in the Western Conference, certainly the best home team in the entire league. They play well. They've got a strong veteran team, good defensively, and so Cagnoni, he didn't end up making as much of being as much of a difference maker in this series as he was in the previous one against the Ontario Reign. That's somewhat disappointing to see, but maybe also a little bit expected. At a point, there is that kind of ceiling that you're going to hit here in your first round. This is a rookie defenseman, 20 years old, young guy, small guy, playing in a tough playoff series against a hard-hitting team like Colorado. At a point, your luck is going to run out. Your luck, I shouldn't really call it luck, but at some point, you're going to come to your end of your rope and maybe start to struggle a little bit. This happens with every rookie, and every time that they get to the playoffs, it's just not as easy to produce in these types of areas. And if we go back to his point totals during the regular season, as I had mentioned in my prospect update, while he had over 50 points, a large percentage of them came on the power play, only 19 points outside of the 5-on-4 advantage. And so him struggling to really make a huge impact in this series 5-on-5, perhaps a little bit expected. I don't think he was necessarily on the defensive side of things a disaster. There were the occasional mistakes for sure, but all in all, a decent enough debut here in the playoffs for Cagnoni, and important to mention, he's only going to get better from here. And then the other defenseman to talk about would be Jack Thompson. I do think Thompson, as per usual throughout pretty much the entirety of these playoffs, he's actually been rather solid, not too many mistakes, not a lot of things where you're thinking, oh wow, Jack Thompson looked really good there, but honestly, I thought he looked just consistently pretty good throughout every single one of these games, more or less. This is the type of player who I don't think did a lot where Grier is thinking, oh, this is someone who I want on my bottom pairing next year, but is someone who I think put up a good enough performance for Grier to at least say, this is someone who I want to have stick around and see where his development takes him in the next year or two. Hopefully the Sharks manage to do that. And then finally, we have the goaltender Yaroslav Askarov. There was a question of whether or not he'd even play here tonight after he left last game due to minor cramps, which in a way you could argue costed the Barracuda that third game, where they end up losing it in overtime when pretty much the first shot, one of the first shots that Carrier actually had to face. But Askarov does return between the pipes. He does finish out this game, and he did play very well. Obviously, in the first and second periods, the Barracuda were the better team, but that doesn't mean that the Eagles got zero chances. Askarov was still tasked with making multiple saves, and he only generally ends up letting in 2 goals here tonight. But it should be noted that he does end up losing the goaltending battle here. The one goal that Chernyshov actually scores is a difficult save to make for Miner, just an unfortunate bounce, and that you could say matches the one from Felleber here, which is just a great shot from the slot. Pretty bad penalty killing from the Barracuda in that area, but the difference-making goal comes from Bradley, the one that ties this one up. It's not a goal in which that is so unique. Obviously, we have seen, even in the NHL, players always try to take these shots from the goal line, from below the goal line, to try and bank it off the goaltender, because it does work relatively frequently enough for players to continue to go back to this well, and it does burn Askarov here. But still, in the playoffs, 1-0 lead that your team just got, you're hoping he would have been able to come up with that save. It doesn't end up happening, but I'm very far from blaming Askarov for this game. I'm very far from blaming him for this series. He still was the Barracuda's best player throughout these 4 games. There's no doubt in my mind about that, and this is someone who will be the Sharks' one of their top 2 goaltenders, perhaps their starter, as soon as next year. But that will do it for this review. The Barracuda will be back in action next season. This team is likely to look a good bit different. Obviously, a couple of these players might end up leaving in the case of Danil Gushin. A couple of these players might end up graduating to the Sharks in the case of Graf, maybe Chernyshov, maybe Colin Graf, or maybe Giles, I should say. And then, of course, there's going to be a new crop of talent as well arriving. Someone like Kasper Halttunen moving from the OHL now to this team. Someone like Cam Lund is likely to be starting next year with the San Jose Barracuda. So there's going to be some changes, there's going to be some movement, and hopefully the Barracuda end up better for it and can make an even deeper run next year. Class dismissed.